So, I get asked a lot, how do you seem to always get people to give you information and answer your questions in depositions? And there's a technique, and I want to talk about it right here because I now feel like I can get most people to say pretty much anything I want. And in fact, it's developed to a point where lawyers in my office, when they have tough depositions, say, hey, will you take this depo? And I'll say, what are the 5 or 6 things I need to get them to admit? And then I go do it. So let's talk about how that happens. Depositions have law, Code of Civil Procedure 2025. There's case law that dictate different rules in a deposition. But taking an effective deposition and getting people to answer your questions and to answer the difficult questions is only about 30% law, and it's 70% art. So let's talk about the law, and then let's talk about the art. Okay. So I've talked about Stewart versus Colonial Western, Stewart. It's a case that you must know, that you know how to spell, because spelling a case on the record just scares the other side for some reason. It is very effective when you can spell a case. And what it stands for is that in a deposition, the only answers that a lawyer can prevent their client from answering is stuff that is private or privileged. So it's not enough to say, I don't know the answer. It calls for legal conclusion. It's not relevant, whatever it is. You can use that case to get them to answer a question. Even if they don't want to answer the question and they say, well, I don't know, I'm not going to tell you, that is good cross-examination. And Stewart allows you to push. And the way you get answers is, one, knowing the law, that if it's not private or privileged, they must answer your question under the law. And then when they don't answer your question, then you push them to where they have to make a choice. They have to say something that makes them look really stupid, that they have no memory, no basic memory, etc., or they answer your question. I want to talk about one very effective technique that most people don't use, but they all do in a deposition, and that's giving an admonition. So what an admonition is, at least normally, was at the beginning of a deposition, a lawyer tells the deponent that they're asking questions of the rules of the deposition. And they do that, and it's called an admonition. I'm going to ask you questions. They're going to be under oath. You can't guess, but I'm entitled to your estimate. Do you understand the difference between an estimate and a guess? A guess is, what's the table length in my home? You've never been there, but you can estimate the table here. Do you understand you're under the penalty of perjury? Blah, 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 blah. And they do that prophylactically to protect against, at trial, reading the depo and having that person go, oh, I didn't understand the process. Now, I've been around for 30 years. I've tried hundreds, 100 plus trials. It's never come up ever, ever, ever. And I realized that it was a wasted opportunity. So I use an admonition as a weapon, as a sword. I start in right away with questions. And I know that once I start asking difficult questions, the normal response to when someone doesn't want to answer a question is, I don't remember, I don't know, I can't be sure, stuff like that. So I wait until I've asked a question that I know somebody has some knowledge about, right? Who was your supervisor? I just can't remember. I just have no idea, right? And then I go into my admonition. Now, sir, ma'am, I just want to stop for a minute. And I want to talk to you about the deposition process. Because, when we're in a cocktail party and somebody comes up to you and asks you a question you don't want to answer, you say, I don't know, change the subject, and then you get away with it. But a deposition is totally different than a social situation because it's under the penalty of perjury and it binds you and maybe your employer. Right? And so the rules of a deposition are totally different than if you're asked a question that you don't want to answer out in the real world. Right? If you have to completely guess, like you have no idea, then you can tell me that. But If you have even some knowledge, I'm entitled to that information. If it's hearsay, I'm entitled to it. If you're not sure, you have to answer the question and tell me you're not sure. But you don't get to say, I don't know, I don't remember, I'm not going to answer your question. And I want to say, because it's the penalty of perjury, they've anticipated that I might ask you some very uncomfortable, very difficult questions. And I'm going to do that in this case. And you're not going to want to answer me. But do you understand that because it's under the penalty of perjury, that this is a legal process, that you're going to have to give me those answers? Are you okay with that? Because that's the law. And then I invariably have seen over the years, I remember an elder abuse case where I had a nurse and she was talking about stuff and then she started to forget, and I used the admonition as a sword. And then I went in and asked a few more questions, and I was waiting for the big thing. I wanted to get somebody to admit that the doctor falsified the records. And I said, ma'am, you'd agree the doctor falsified, it's clear the doctor falsified the records. And she goes, well, I don't know. I said, ma'am, you remember we talked about the admonition, and this is one of those uncomfortable questions that if you have some idea, you got to answer me, even if you think it hurts you or it hurts the doctor. So let me ask you again. Doctor falsified the records. And they always say, well, if it has to be under the penalty of perjury, yes, I think he did falsify the records, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see that just the law, the admonition, the normal thing that everybody does, that 30%, now applying 70% art to that law, changes a non-issue, basically a neutral statement, into a weapon to force people to answer questions because you've taken it out of the norm. I've got many, many other techniques, but Stewart and the admonition are two very powerful techniques to get people to answer questions when they really don't want to, especially the ones that are important to your case.